Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As many of you probably know, if you've listened to my show at all, I'm really quite interested in democracy and some of the challenges that we're facing with our democracy right now. And I ran into a gentleman by the name of Murray Simser, who is a really interesting guy. He's got a fascinating background, and he's come up with this idea of an app called Citizn that is going to really poll us on a fairly regular basis in regards to what we're thinking about. And he's going to use this as a way of really guiding our politicians, if not frankly telling them what to do. And he's invited along with him today two different people. One individual who I know well and who has been very involved in politics in the past, Nick Ruszkowski, who is on his advisory board. And then the host of a big event that he had recently at Massey College, U of T, who really, I think the event really brought together a lot of different people thinking about democracy and what the challenges are. Pauline Couture, is that the correct pronunciation, Pauline?
Fair enough.
Thanks so much. So maybe Murray, you could kick it off by telling us a little bit, and we'll go into more depth in a while, but just give us a little orientation of what you are trying to do as Citizn, if you could, sir.
Yeah, look, I think it's the biggest problem of our time is the level of disaffection that people have from their governments, whether you're on the left or the right, is almost total these days. There aren't any satisfied sort of voters out there. And the question you have to ask yourself is why? And it's not a blame thing. It doesn't matter if it's a Liberal government or a Tory government or a Green or an NDP government. The dissatisfaction is the same, and it's becoming worse and worse and worse. In a world with AI-generated content, okay, that is exploding, the traditional voices of the people, the media, the government itself, and all the other moderating forces, corporations, lobbyists, and the infrastructure of politics is no longer able to keep up. And so the share of voice of that traditional stuff, the fourth estate, is being overwhelmed by the modern printing press, which is the social networks that are out there. And you're no longer contending with just a local cohort of people trying to inform a debate, whether it's media on the left or the right or politicians. You actually have this entire world of AI-generated content coming from all corners of the globe. It's insufficient, our current infrastructure, and Citizn aims to remedy that by making democracy as easy as an app. And what it's going to do, in the simplest terms, is that the power of the election is going to be brought down to 5 or 6 decisions a day that citizens are going to engage in. And their power will be 5 or 6 times a day, not once every 4 years.
Nick Ruszkowski, you've been involved in politics quite a bit. Do people want to be involved in decisions 5 or 6 times a day? Like, come on, really?
Well, let's take a step back from that, Brian, and maybe talk about less the technology and the app and more about the reason why Murray and I came together, which has much more to do with an assessment of where democracy is today. So if I look at the traditional definition that we have of democracy as representation by the people and for the people through a series of individual institutions that guarantee their rights to be represented through elected officials, I think what has happened is that mode of understanding democracy has grown quite outdated. I'm starting to think much more of democracy as an ecosystem or an organism. And the fact is that it's not sufficient to think only about the institutions that we have in place that help us defend our rights. It's more helpful to think about collectively how each of those institutions, how citizens, how the media, how elected officials, how business, how social and civil society interact to solve real world problems within that ecosystem. And I think that my assessment would be that what's damaged is the ecosystem. And the promise of Citizn to me is to create a platform where willing members of the ecosystem can come together and solve real world problems in real time through dialogue, discussion, and then action. And so if I had to put it that way, I'm less worried about whether everybody wants to be involved in talking about how to solve problems 5 or 6 times a day, and more worried about creating a platform where people who want to partake in the redevelopment of that ecosystem can do so free from what I would call the oppression of the existing algorithms that are designed to accentuate our differences as opposed to focus on what it is that we have in common.
the oppression of the existing algorithms that control. That's really kind of interesting, Nick. We'll have to come back to that because I think it's absolutely fascinating. Pauline, you I understand were the host of a big event at Massey College, and Murray tells me that it was sold out. There was quite a lot of people interested in the discussion. Why?
Well, I think that the breakdown of trust is being felt across the spectrum. Everyone is feeling the breakdown of trust, and it has to do in part with disintermediation of elites. Elites often actually just means in people who have taken the time to learn in depth about something. And if those kind of people are not engaged in helping the broader public understand things, then there's a kind of a vulnerability that occurs. And we see the consequences most glaringly, I think, at the local level, because so many local media have gone down, and there's nobody going to City Hall and covering the meetings. There's nobody, people have lost the bridge.
And the turnouts in election are dismal. It's like,
well, that's what it shows too, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we've got some time to talk about all this, but I think that the loss of trust and the disintermediation of the explainers has a lot to do with it.
Well, this is going to be an interesting conversation about democracy and whether Citizen is potentially something that can solve it. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Murray, Nick, and Pauline in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is, I guess, really democracy and what Nick Ruszkowski called the oppression of the existing algorithms. And does Murray have a solution with his app, his idea of Citizen? And it's kind of intriguing. I wonder, before we get into it all over again, if we could just chat for a minute or two about each one of your backgrounds and why that's relevant to this conversation and to Citizen. Murray, maybe we could start with you because you've got really quite an interesting background both in politics and in Silicon Valley. Isn't that correct?
It is. And both of those two worlds collided in 2016 when I decided, you know what, I've had enough and I'm going to set up Citizen. But the origin story of Murray and why Citizen is because as a kid, when I moved out of Toronto from what was a working class neighborhood and a working class family, it really didn't have much reach. I ended up in Ottawa, and for 4 years, I worked for the Liberal Party, I worked on the Hill, I worked for members of Parliament, I worked for Jean Chrétien, the official leader of the opposition's office. And I cut my teeth doing elections, investitures, and all the rest. So I know the system. I know how it works. I fundamentally have invested in it. And then I got carried off by the dot-com boom to California and became a technology founder of one of the dot-coms of the time that was reasonably successful. Tech and innovation combined with politics does not marry. The closest I ever got was that Service Canada's 1-800-0-Canada phone number was backed by my CRM software that I built in Silicon Valley, and I thought that was it. And then in 2016 to 2018, politics started to fall apart. And the short version is Citizen is the answer to 4 years of really deep thinking, research and effort, not just by me, but by a range of people that have contributed to this thing. And I think my background puts me in a unique position to reinvent technologically how we do democracy.
Awesome. Nick Ruszkowski, you've been involved in politics, you've been involved in GR and PR and actually hockey. So what's that all got to do with Citizen? You're on mute, sir.
Let me try and pull those four threads together. The first part of my career and my professional background was devoted entirely to politics in the Canadian context. Through the Liberal Party of Canada, first as a Liberal Party official, as National Director of the Young Liberals of Canada, then through various roles in Parliament, both in senators' offices, MPs' offices, and also on Parliament Hill, with a couple of ministers and political party leaders. I took that experience and leveraged it into an international experience with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Central and Eastern Europe, and really was part of helping to rebuild the democratic infrastructure in members or former members of the Warsaw Pact, where democracy had come crumbling down and was being built back up in the early 2000s. I went into government relations, and that is, full disclosure, an environment in which I am currently an entrepreneur, public affairs, and media and issues management. And of course, through the Ottawa Senators, Brian, what you and I share in common is perhaps a very unique understanding of the fact that community not only wants agency over how it's governed, but also over how it's entertained, how it connects, how it convenes. And so if you pull those four threads together, I think what I bring to the table is a pretty good example of somebody who's lived that ecosystem that we're talking about, that brings citizenship, institutions, civic organizations, and now technology together to try and see if we can't do what the way I look at Citizen is not an app that's going to solve everything. It's an app that has the potential to become part of the ecosystem, and a relevant part of the ecosystem, by virtue of replicating what's supposed to happen that's virtuous within that ecosystem.
You know, it's fascinating, your comments about how people really want to have influence on sports. You're right. People feel like they own their sports team. So maybe, Murray, you've got an app that's lets all the citizens become the GM and the coach to tell the GM and the coach what players they should be trading and putting on
mock parliament writ large. Okay,
but it's true. People really do feel like they have ownership on some of these entities. Yeah. Pauline, tell us a little bit about yourself and what attracted you to Citizen, if you could.
Well, I have four threads too, or four hats, maybe I'll call them. My early career was primarily in journalism, broadcast and print. I was a young reporter on campaign buses and elections, so on the other side of things from these guys. And that's very deeply anchored in me. That observer, analyst, explainer role is very near and dear to my heart. So journalism and the corollary, later writing books and ghostwriting and all that kind of thing. Second thread is when I left the CBC after hosting, be anchoring news and doing all kinds of things there for 10 years in Montreal and Ottawa and Montreal. I started a strategic communications consultancy, which I'm still running in various ways. I've advised a lot of CEOs, C-suite people, media training, research reports, all kinds of things. So serving clients as a consultant. Thirdly, I've got a hat as a tech entrepreneur and founder of a blockchain platform to finance film and television content for the last 4 years, which is either going to morph or die sometime soon. And
a blockchain platform to finance film and television.
Well, let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Oh my gosh, that could be a whole other fascinating conversation.
Okay. Yeah, it's another conversation. And the fourth hat is I'm a deeply engaged volunteer. And I've done, years and years and years of volunteer work for all kinds of organizations. I've been vice chair of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. I was chair of the steering committee of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, which was founded originally by my husband. I was chair before we were a couple, but we became a couple as a result, and then I resigned. But one of the things we did at Friends of Canadian Broadcasting is we founded an award called the Dalton Camp Award, which and I was on the jury for 20 years before stepping back. And that is it's a cash prize with a medal by the late great Dorota Pittery Hunt, who did The Queen on the Looney. It gives an award for an essay that makes the link between media and democracy. And through that, the cohorts over 20 years that have graduated from that award, some of them have gone on to become, big, for example, Matthew Akins, who has been based in Afghanistan for the last 10 years and written a remarkable book and writes for the New York Times Magazine. He's one of the winners of the Dalton Camp Award, I think 2005, probably something like that, So for me, it's a long interest from many angles, and including when I was at CBC, I was host of a daily 1-hour phone-in show where subjects of democracy were constantly on the table, and the interaction with the general public was very much part. And you can see how people care deeply about things, but they just don't know how to influence them, and that's one of the things that ties back to Murray and Nick here.
Pauline, maybe I could ask you a little bit about media for a second here. My sense in watching Fox, CNN, and even CBC and CTV is that there's so much sort of talking head opinion and not a lot of investigative journalism or real
Costs
analysis
money,
of
Brian.
policies.
It costs money. It costs money. Talking heads and opinions are cheap.
Is that what it is?
Investigating, it's a big part of it. I mean, we've allowed our media, to take, so for example, the Southern newspaper group, okay, that's happens to be an organization I know quite well for a number of reasons. When it ended up in the hands of a US venture capital fund, their only interest is squeezing as much money as they can out of the damn place, and they've just laid off. I mean, the Montreal Gazette is now a hollowed out little tiny shell, and what you're starting to see is, and I'm hearing through the grapevine that in Montreal there are local citizens, both Anglophones and Francophones, who care about the existence of a solid English language daily newspaper in Montreal and are preparing to try and rescue it in some way. But these hedge funds, I mean, they don't care. They're just squeezing the money out, and you cannot serve the public adequately with that mindset.
I guess I had a different. I guess I had a different opinion. And you're undoubtedly right, not me. But I thought that so much of it now is just entertainment. It's not information. It's just having Tucker Carlson or somebody or other on CNN or even Power and Politics just sort of making outrageous statements.
Tucker Carlson doesn't pretend to be a journalist. He knows he's an entertainer. I don't find him very entertaining because I want to vomit every time he opens his mouth. But I mean, it's disgusting. It's preying on people's fears. It's exploiting the worst aspects of human nature. There's nothing aspirational or positive or constructive about it. And if we don't have aspirational, constructive conversations about the future of our society and how we want things to be, then it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And also, I mean, in politics, the having to live under a microscope like that, and for women especially, I mean, women journalists and politicians right now are I mean, the Governor General of Canada has just taken down all the commentary feed, all the comment fields in her social media, because it was so distressingly racist, misogynistic, violent, and threatening that it's not a viable thing. Now, that is a really, really sad comment on our, someone who is a fantastic person, our first Indigenous Governor General. She's had to shut it down. That's where we are.
Yeah, I think media is a problem, and Murray talked about social media and how it's sort of overwhelmed everything, and there's no question that's a big issue right now. Nick, I want to come back to you about this, the oppression of the algorithms or the existing algorithms, which I think is interesting. Let me give you a couple of data points that you probably know better than I, but the current Premier of Ontario was elected by 40% to 40% of the people that turned out. So some people are saying, 18 to 20% of the people actually voted for Guy that's now got a majority government. And in that election, a conservative vote was worth something like 10 times what a vote for the Green Party was worth. You elected 10 times more MPPs. A Liberal vote was worth 1/6 an NDP vote. The same number of people voted Liberal as voted NDP, approximately, and the NDP got 6 times as many seats as the Liberals. So I thought that one of the big issues is sort of our first past the post system versus a popular opinion or proportional representation or something like that. And then the second thing that I think that a lot of people were worried about is sort of leader-oriented politics, that it's all about who the leader is rather than the local member of parliament or member of provincial parliament, et cetera. And so I would have thought that you've got, with these existing algorithms, the way you described it, the existing structure, really, and Pauline used this word, lack of trust, but you've got a sense that people just their vote doesn't matter. Is that the problem, or am I being overly analytical?
I don't think you're being overly analytical. I think it is part of the problem. I don't think it's the whole problem. And I think part of what we're all challenged with right now is that the reason it's so important to, in Pauline's words, volunteer, or in the words of the earlier conversation that we had about why we're involved with Citizen, to get involved with programs of this nature, is because we need a multiplicity of points of view to solve a variety of problems. So that's the first point that I want to make. Second point that I want to make is, Brian, I've lived and worked in 7 democracies, all of which have different electoral systems, some of which are proportional, some of which are mixed member proportional, some of which are first past the post, some of which have runoffs, and any variation of those. I can't in good conscience think that the system is the problem first and foremost. My understanding of how I've experienced those democracies is that what has become the problem is something that is bigger than the oppression of the algorithm, but that's analogous to it. So Murray said that democracy started breaking down in 2017, 2018, earlier in the show. I would take some issue with that and say that I would trace it back.
He's a young guy.
No, that was just my personal return, Nick. My personal return.
I would map it back to the late 90s and the early 2000s when we started getting in media micro-targeting and specialty channels, in politics micro-targeting, and a whole bunch of very similar phenomenon that are designed to really reward advertisers, or in the world of social media, to reward clickbait by serving up content, messages, ideas that speak to my individual interests as Nick Ruszkowski, a citizen, but not necessarily to the common interests that I share
Filter
with my
bubbles.
neighbors. And so if you think of my comment about the oppression of the algorithm, yes, it's a problem, but I think it's a problem that is the expression of the true reality, which is that innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. Innovation is a product of the evolution that has happened before it. And so when we got obsessed with micro-targeting, confirmation bias, user-tailored content that is really focused on the individual, as opposed to some of the more important pieces of our collective experience, is when the slippery slope started. And what I'm hoping to see in Citizen and in other initiatives is a return back to pulling at the thread of some of our common interests a little bit more assertively, because we often forget that we have a lot more in common than we do that separates us.
If I may, Brian, I'd like to address that for a moment, if I
Please.
may, Brian.
Yep.
The atomization, the micro, all of those things that Nick is evoking he's absolutely right. And the idea of a shared space, I mean, a common factual base for starters, like if we're not dealing from the same facts, how can we possibly agree on policy? But there are, Quebec is a very interesting example. I'm a Francophone and I work in French and English all the time. And I'm always struck so much by the differences. And these are simple things, really. But for example, in French, if in Quebec, on Sunday nights, there is a show that is it's over 2 hours long. And it's called Tout le monde en parle. So everybody's talking about it. And it literally is a form of kind of national hearth that everyone gathers around. And what's brilliant about it, and this is a French format that the CBC owns. They own the right to do this in English. They've always refused to do it because their mindset is American. And they own the rights. They could be doing this in English too. And they could be really differentiating the English network in the same way. But in French, what happens is on Sunday night, a guy shows up, he's got a live studio audience, and he's welcoming into his studio around a table politicians, actors, scientists, sports stars, ordinary people who've saved a kid from drowning, like just a mix of people from across the board from society. And they're having conversations that everybody is listening to and everybody's entertained by, and it creates a sense of belonging, of having shared stakes in the society that have been lost in English Canada to a large extent. You can't name anything except Hockey Night in Canada. Maybe it's not where it used to be, and it skews heavily male, but there isn't a thing, a shared space for conversations, and not just across cultures, but across professions, across sectors of society. There's no shared space to establish common assessments of what's going on, to exchange ideas freely and comfortably, and have fun with it. We see each other as human beings who share our society. We need that. We really need that. And I think there are things we could be doing to fix it.
We need a shared space. And Murray is got something that he thinks will be a solution to all of that. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in 2 minutes. I'm going to turn to Murray and I'm going to ask him, okay, so Nick and Pauline have talked about some of the problems. You think you got a solution. What is that solution? And how does it work? And why is it going to work? Stay with us, everyone. We're going to come back and hear what the solution is to solve the oppression of the algorithms. Citizen, stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Interesting conversation tonight about the state of our democracy, really, and a potential solution that Murray Simser has got, which is I think it's an app, but Nick Ruszkowski has talked about it as being substantially more than an app called Citizen. Nick Ruszkowski, who's a GR, PR, man around town kind of guy, and Pauline Couture, who's a former media host and anchor and reporter, and someone that's really, I think, raised a really interesting point in the last segment in regards to our need for a shared space, and that might exist Sunday nights in Quebec, but it doesn't exist in Canada. And I think that's something we got to come back to. But Murray, these guys have sort of described a problem, I think really well described by Nick as this, the oppression of the current algorithms. Yeah. What are you going to do about it?
Well, history is instructive. First and foremost, meet people where they are. Okay, if you think back to the printing press's arrival in Europe, it destabilized the two original medias, the Pope, which was through the bishop, the pulpit, and the monarch, or the executive power of a state, through the magistrates. That's where you got your information from. There was nothing else. Okay, along came the printing press, and within a couple of decades, 20,000 different pamphlets had been printed, and all of them stood in opposition to the two core voices that ran the polity, which was at the time Christendom. Okay, Christendom fractured into what is now Europe, and that fracturing caused hundreds and hundreds of years of war. So from my perspective, if you don't get people back to the table talking, that's what you end up with. And so the solution is space. Okay. In the old days, the market square was where you went to get those two pieces of information, or church. That was your space. Those were the public spaces. Today, in the time between that and now, the public spaces are Parliament, the legislature, universities, media, experiences like this, shared spaces where dialogue takes place about politics. And for 300 years, that worked. The problem now is, as Nick pointed out, the oppression of the algorithm is not like these algorithms are trying to get us. But the fact of the matter is, any new technology, just like the printing press, naturally overwhelms that which came before. When the entire world is connected, your core group of people that influence you naturally changes from your neighborhood or your country, okay, at a maximum when we were all sort of children, to now it's the whole planet. So your points of view are from everywhere. If you really still want to maintain a democratic state like Canada, the United States, or any other, there has to be a shared national space. Okay, full stop. And if we don't have a shared national space, as they pointed out, what we end up with is other people dominating our conversation. First, you got to create the space. Back in the days of the printing press, the democracy house, the parliament, was the creation that gave us that space. That's what they did to compensate and create authority again in view of all of these different crazy people telling regular people what to believe. And that new space is called Citizen. And
you think Citizen, your app, is going to become this shared national space?
I do, and I call it the sixth estate. And the first estate is the executive, the legislature, the judicial. First three estates. 4 is media. 5 is the internet. Where are the people in all that? Well, the assumption historically is that we're always represented by somebody else. We need a sixth estate that's our own estate, where we decide what the conversation is going to be, and we hold all the other estates to account. And that space is called Citizen. Call it a kitchen table, call it a discussion space, call it a parliament, call it whatever you want, but it's ours, and it's going to be controlled by the people.
But it's an app. And so you want people to go on 5 or 6 times a day, you described, to make votes, poll decisions, comments on national issues, and that's
absolutely
going to create our national space.
Yeah, because right now, basically 17% of most posts that are out there are whining about the government. And then the government goes along and buys all these data sets from media and pollsters and the rest that take advantage of that public information, which is not controlled. And all the government is asking is, how do we get their attention? How do we get their vote? Is that in our interest? The answer is, if Citizn's in the middle, it will be. Because Citizn's going to set the agenda, not have the agenda told to us by whether it's the politicians or the media. You know, you made the joke about Fox News. Fox News is probably the original, what I'll call micro-targeting type of media. They went after a specific audience. Well, now it's gotten so good that every person is its own little thing. If you don't have an algorithm to compete with that, you lose. And our algorithm will be stronger, better, and more capable of delivering a happy electorate using this kitchen table concept of an app. And why an app? Really simple. That's what people want. They don't want to have to go to a hall and stand in line and give tickets and nonsense. They want to be able to manage their government in 10 seconds. And they already spend 4.5 hours on their phones a day on other apps. Why not spend 6 minutes on this?
Nick, what do you think? Is it a good idea? Will it work?
I want to link 2 ideas, one that Murray raised and one that Pauline raised, and hopefully bring them to a crescendo that we can use to launch the next phase of our conversation. So Pauline mentioned Tout le monde en parle and its role as really the last destination television on TV where people can come and talk about everything under the sun from a multiplicity of perspectives and truly connect, which means connect across interests and across mindsets. Murray mentioned that the world has never been more connected through the internet. So let me play with that idea for a second. Members of the world as individuals have never been more connected to other like-minded members than they are now. But if you look at, for example, studies on mental health and isolation, we also know that children and adolescents of this current reality where we're supposed to be more connected are feeling more isolated from each other than they ever have had. The incidence of anxiety, depression, isolation is higher than it ever has been. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we truly connecting in a healthy and meaningful way, or are we falling prey to over-reliance and over-indexation on algorithms that reward our confirmation biases and our very individualistic interests? And if that's what we believe, and we also want to do what Pauline is talking about and create a space for a genuine exchange and connection across points of view and disciplines and mindsets, then what we need is an algorithm that does the opposite of what the existing algorithms do, and which rewards the sharing of disparate points of view, the reconciliation of disagreements through discourse, the celebration and the prioritization of information that is reliably factual. And so I think that without wanting to invest too much hope in Citizen alone, because like I said, I don't believe it is the solution, I believe it is part of the solution, I think what we really need to work towards is a space where people can convene to talk not only about politics from the point of view of civic and political and educated, policy-minded people, but from the point of view of people who absolutely thrive, celebrate, and grow as a result of exchanging from a very disparate perspective, from a disparate series of perspectives on a whole host of issues. And that, Brian, I think is how you get people to engage, I would say, in real time. I don't care whether they're engaging 6 or 7 times a day. I care whether they're engaging in real time in meaningful conversations.
So because in those silos, when people are in silos and not seeing anybody who doesn't agree with them, they demonize those people. Disagreement means demonization. And it's very hard to demonize someone that you're actually having a glass of wine with across a table. You know, if you're in the same shared space with someone, you know, kind of elementary politeness kicks in, you will listen a little bit, and you can't demonize them anymore. So we have to demonize. That's the.
I understand this, and Murray talks about the Stanford study that forced people of different political persuasion to sit down and talk about issues without divulging their background, and that they actually came to some resolution, and that's kind of idealistically nice. But Pauline, do people want to? You know, I do business in the United States a lot, in the southern United States, and you go into every bar and every lobby of every office building and every hotel and every senior's home and things like that. The TVs are turned to Fox. They are channeling one thing. People want to have confirmation bias, Nick. They want to talk to people that are in their own echo chamber. They want to believe what they believe, and you know. I don't want to talk
throw
about
in more guns than you got people, and you got.
Well, Brian, I'm gonna, if I can jump in over Pauline here and challenge you for a second. Again, I'm going to take tout le monde en
That's not the first time you've done that, Nick.
But there's a reason why a French language television show in a province of the size of Quebec, which is smaller than Ontario and certainly smaller than the rest of English Canada, outperforms any single English language show
in
on
hard
television.
numbers.
In hard numbers. We're talking about
not
between
ratio, numbers.
We're talking between 3 to 4 million people every Sunday night tuning into one show. And destination television of that kind, as you know, Brian, because we've been confronted with this in the context of professional sport, it doesn't exist like that anymore. And so you need to ask yourself, what is it that they have done to bottle that kind of magic? And I think that the success of that show is evidence to me that if you build a venue and a shared space where it is safe, fun, interesting, enriching to bring multiple points of view and contradictory points of view to bear, there is a lot to be gained from that. And I think that part of the reason that people believe that they want Fox or CNBC, because that's the other side of it, or sensational confirmation bias-based news and entertainment, is because it's been decades since they've been served the alternative. And so what we have here is also a failure to innovate. And by the way, I'm not just blaming the media. I think political parties, I think civic organizations, I think corporations are all guilty of the same over-reliance on what is tried and tested and commercially viable, and therefore in a state of complacency, which has dissuaded innovation at this point.
You know, I gotta tell you that I was really very disturbed by this inquiry on the Emergency Measures Act that came out and said effectively that we had a failure in our democracy, a failure in our politics. And you know, I think one of the things they talked about is how maybe for political reasons, because they were catering to their base, one political premier didn't want to sit down at a table with another political prime minister. But in addition, you know, it talked about how our prime minister didn't want to listen to people and was talking them down. And yet the leader of the opposition was completely talking to a different echo chamber in a different group and encouraging them. And so our politics really has had this challenge and has gone with this, whether it's confirmation bias or micro-targeting or whatever. We have polarization like we've never had before, such that, you know, in a national inquiry, a guy says that there's a failure of our democracy, a failure of our politics. It's a problem.
Yeah, let me jump in on the point of polarization. When I told you that my two worlds of sort of innovation and politics recollided, it was because the Trump and Trudeau elections happened in North America. And I put those two people in the same sentence, and what you would never think of putting them in the same sentence because they're politicians of a different stripe. But what I started to realize is that they're politicians. And historically, politicians have been sort of moderated by the other estates that existed within the society, okay? And there was only so much of a news cycle that you could do damage through. And, you know, Peter Mansbridge had a goal, which was to keep his authority and credibility so he wouldn't, you know, you talk about serious things. That's no longer the case. And I asked the next question, is the consequence that we're more polar than we've ever been? And so if you go study history, again, extremely instructive, it turns out we're not. Now, this is really interesting, but there's a big difference today in that there's no longer moderating forces. And the only time in history where that has happened is when the printing press arrived. And the two moderating forces, the bishop that said, you be good, and the magistrate that said, you don't break the law, which were the two moderating forces in society back then, were overwhelmed with people saying, stop going to church, stop giving your money to the Pope. These were serious, polarizing things. People were burned at the stake over these matters. So we are not more polarized today than we were. But because humans are humans, and humans, if you look at sort of groupthink psychology and you look at priming groups, and then you look at the results of priming those groups, throughout history, we've seen people use bully pulpits of leadership like the games in Rome to stir up the crowd and make the crowd do stupid stuff. The difference is now there's zero moderating factor. People literally think they're in the Hunger Games and that they got to go get the Capitol on January 6th because, President Snow, it has taken over. This is crazy. And this is real, normal Americans. And the same thing applies to Canadians, and the same thing applies to Europeans. It's not exclusive to here or there. The fact is, nobody's telling them, hey, that's not right. And until we have that back, okay, people are going to get worse before they get better. And if you look at history, when it does actually get worse, that's war, that's destabilization, that's famine. People die, lives are lost, wealth is destroyed, property is wrecked. You don't want the outcome of this thing. And I'll say this, one last thing. Marshall McLuhan said it best, okay? The medium is the message. And right now, the medium of media is not moderating the other power estates in the country. So the medium is the message for media means it's entertainment, almost all of it, meaning there is no moderating factor. We need to replace that. And my thesis in any case is that Citizen is a mechanism to do that.
So we need that English version of your Sunday night Quebec show, or, there was the show on television that talked about how when I was growing up, we had, 2 or 3 anchors that we listened to, and they were all objective. They weren't columnists. They weren't commentators. They were people that actually you could trust to give us factual news. And we've lost that. Right. Pauline, is media the problem? Should we be funding a different media?
Well, media is absolutely essential. And, we have a public broadcaster in Canada like all of the other civilized OECD countries except the United States, which doesn't really have a public media. PBS is partly funded by a small grant from the government. It's mostly funded by, we used to call it the Tanks and Tutus station. We have to have media that is solid and able to function objectively and in public service. And unfortunately, we've got right now, but now since the Harper's era especially, the Conservative Party has taken the tack to defund the only major public institution we have. My view of it is that what we should be doing is, and it should be absolutely sacrosanct source of money, the way the BBC has always been run, for example, or NHK in Japan. It's not subject to parliamentary whim or cutbacks from whatever. And I think that given that private media have been shriveling and drying up everywhere, that the CBC should, on the news front at least, become more like the Canadian press, like a model where it's public service journalism that is not competing with the private media, but available, that the private media can come and get pieces if they want, and that they're covering, the country's covered. We have no coverage, and we've lost, I think, 150, 200 small newspapers in the last couple of years. Like, it's just insane. There's nobody going to town halls to cover municipal politics. We've lost these sources that are essential for people to be able to make democratic decisions. And I think that's a huge problem.
I still get 2 print newspapers delivered every morning. My kids think I'm nuts. They've never even looked at it. It's crazy. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Murray is number one, launching this app soon. We're going to ask him if we can test it out. And number two, he's raising money, and we're going to find out if we can invest in it. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've had a lot of fun tonight talking about the challenges of democracy. I think Nick Ruszkowski described it really interestingly and well with his the abuse. No, it wasn't the abuse. What was the word you used? The
oppression of the algorithm. The
oppression of the existing algorithms. I thought that was really kind of fun. Murray, you've got this app. Citizen. It's in beta testing now, and you're going to launch it live shortly.
It's already launched. You can actually, on January, we soft launched it last year at Mars Discovery District, downtown Toronto, at an event. And we then hard launched it on January 23rd, and when we attended an event that was hosted not by us, but by Massey College. And so if you want to download it and you're in Canada, you can do so. Go to your app store on your phone, Android or Apple, Android or iOS, and it's there. But the sort of nature of this is the concept of the app you should think of as it's no different than website, okay? The modern version of a website's an app. It's the place where you go on the internet to do something, and it's an order of magnitude more complex and more interesting. It's the ultimate expression of the two-dimensional internet. Okay, the metaverse is the three-dimensional internet, if you want to think about it in simple terms. So in the future, it won't be an app; it'll be a virtual world where we all get together in town halls and we sit and talk, and it'll be super fun. But Citizen itself is not the technology that makes it possible. Okay, think of the television as the technology, that's the app, but think of the content as what Citizen actually is. And what is that content? That content is first capture the voice of people every single day on every real issue before the government, not general things like climate change or issues of this or that or the other thing, in simple ways that express what the people want of the government. Number two, inform all the people on that platform before they give their opinions, so they're not giving opinions without knowing what they're talking about. And three, make sure only legitimate electors are allowed into the platform. And if you do all that, you do something really cool that helps even Pauline's concern about media. You can invite the media to come to the platform, and you can pay them on a streaming basis, real money, to tell us what they think about those very specific things that are going on at the government before I give my opinion as a citizen. We will pay all the journalists to join Citizen on our platform as citizen journalists that will do it in our format, in our way, when we need it, and they'll make a ton of money, just like they're now doing on streaming. Everybody hated streaming before, but now streaming is the greatest thing since sliced bread. In the end, what this ultimately does is it creates that table we talked about. It creates that space, but it also creates a place that's reliable and safe and capable. And Citizen as a company is a startup corporation. And so that means that we are raising money for the company. Right now, we did a crowdfunding activity a few years ago. Regular people from Canada invested and made this possible. We raised several $100,000 through that mechanism. We're quite proud that Canadians, regular Canadians, funded this, because this is for the people. It's not for fancy types, okay? Number two, the second round of funding is going to be larger, and that's an accredited round of funding that we're currently undertaking. And, we'll talk to people about that another time. But in the end, this is innovation in the truest sense of the word. It's Silicon Valley meets politics, and it puts it in your pocket. And then all the profits, 70% of the money from that platform, goes into the hands of the people that they can use to fix their society and make sure the government follows what we, the people, want them to do.
You're obviously very passionate about this, and it's exciting. Thank you. Pauline, is this the shared space? Is it got the potential to be a shared space?
I think it does. It's probably, as Nick said, it's not the whole solution, but, as a deeply engaged person who cares deeply about democracy and about the society I live in, I when I first heard about this, I thought, well, this is exciting. This is an opportunity to try and pierce these silos and start, breaking, having things happening across and having some control, having some input, having some being heard. I think I'm very hopeful. Yeah. And I love Murray. I can't say no to him.
Nick Ruszkowski. last word to you. Is this going to solve your oppression of the current algorithms?
Well, I'm going to do a classic case of bridging and blocking, Brian, and I'm going to go to an earlier question that you asked, which caused me to think actually quite a lot in the last few minutes while others were talking. You asked whether people actually want this. And so what that forced me to think about in the context of the conditions under which a shared space like this can work is it only works if we step away from our traditional notion of democracy as being a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that rests entirely on the creation of institutions that are there to essentially protect our rights, including things like the media. And we evolve that to think very critically about what our own responsibilities are, not only as citizens, but also as corporations, as news organizations, as political parties, as leaders. And I'll just end on two notes on that front in terms of what our responsibilities are. I think from the perspective of corporations, of news media, of political parties, there's a desperate need for innovation. It really does fatigue me to no end to hear that the best that we can do in Canada from a media innovation perspective is force Google and Facebook and others, who, by the way, I don't hold in the highest repute, to pay news organizations extra money for content without requiring those news organizations to demonstrate a level of entrepreneurship and innovation themselves that brings them to a different plateau. And I could say the same thing about a number of other organizations, corporations, and political parties. But the second thought is that this only works if citizens take their responsibilities seriously and decide that they will actually work hard, tooth and nail, to get out of government what it is that they are putting in through these shared spaces that we want to convene. So I'll leave you on that note. I'm actually quite convinced that people have the desire to do that. I have a 6-year period of my career under my belt in Central and Eastern Europe where people had been deprived of those freedoms and responsibilities for many decades, and responded by engaging in ways that people had thought was just impossible. So that's my 2 cents worth, Brian.
Nick Ruszkowski, Pauline Couture, Murray Simser, Citizen, thank you so much for joining us and telling us a little bit about our democracy, the challenges we're faced, and the potential solution in an app called Citizen. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Good night.